final game of the Florida high school football season is usually played on a Saturday night under the lights. Some of the state's largest schools have big dreams of becoming champions. A few years ago, on a humid night in Orlando, an undefeated team was in search of its first state championship. They faced an upstart who was not supposed to be there. Mandarin High School lost 3 of its first 5 games, but improbably advanced to the Saturday night showdown with Christopher Columbus High School in the final. Amid the mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, classmates, and friends in the stands was United States Senator Marco Rubio. In true storybook fashion, Mandarin used a defensive stop with just 79 seconds remaining to win by 2 points. Like every other Columbus High School parent that night, Rubio was bitterly disappointed in the outcome. But he didn't say the game was rigged, or that Mandarin used ineligible players, or that the Mustangs received favorable calls. Instead, Rubio tweeted his congratulations and mentioned the victors were champions as players and men because of their post-game sportsmanship. In doing so, he reinforced the core truth. In sports, there are noble facts. There are opinions as well, but the most respected opinions are girded by facts and observations. And usually, everyone accepts the final score. Shouldn't that be the case for democracy as well? I'm a native Floridian who spent a decade as a sports reporter before moving on to cover policy and inequality. From my perch in the press box, and occasionally on the sidelines of countless games across the Sunshine State, I've learned something important. Amateur athletics are a blueprint for navigating the hyper-partisan political era that envelops us. It's through watching people watch children's games that I'm reminded that American democracy can be brought back from the brink if we incorporate some of the lessons that many of us learned as young athletes. The first, losing stinks. It's absolutely not fun. I hate it more than the idea of walking across asphalt in August, but sometimes it happens, and that's okay. Acknowledging that someone was superior on a given day is drilled into amateur athletes like a grass stain in the springtime. Successes between the lines, just like at the voting booth, are hard-earned. In 1997, a baseball team from Bradenton made the Little League World Series. I was super excited. I knew one of the players, and it was amazing to see them get that far. They got all the way to the semifinals before their ace pitcher couldn't go because his arm was sore. They lost by 11 runs. I remember watching the game on cable television. My fellow Floridians gave it everything they had. They competed. They lost. They congratulated their opponent. That's what's supposed to happen, right? If only. I think back to the weeks after the 2020 presidential election when Republicans across the country wanted to contest election results. To his credit, Rubio cut them off at the pass. Democracy, he said at the time, is held together by people's confidence in the election and a willingness to abide by its results. Today, in 2024, polling from the Associated Press and the University of Chicago found that 54% of Americans believe this country has a poorly functioning democracy. That's a problem for all of us. That leads me to another point. Sportsmanship is not weakness. Sometimes there are people who, within the spirit and letter of the rules, are better than you. In sports, it happens all the time. When it does, most children, despite their disappointment, congratulate the victor and keep it moving. Before he became a Rhodes Scholar, United States Senator, and presidential candidate, Bill Bradley was an All-American basketball player from a small Missouri community. Bradley lost the biggest basketball game his college ever played in during the 1965 NCAA Men's Final Four. He later won a pair of NBA titles with the New York Knicks in the early 70s. But you know what took Bradley from Crystal City, Missouri to Capitol Hill? The lessons he learned on the basketball court, including how to disagree openly, honestly, and civilly. In other words, how to practice good sportsmanship. It was that skill set, not necessarily his jumper, that helped Bradley build a long and storied political career. As he argues in a recent book, if the United States is to overcome its current divisiveness, we must recommit to treating each other with respect, to being good sports. I learned that lesson early, and the hard way. I think I was 8 years old when I lost a soccer game and told our opponent, "Bad game," in the post-game handshake line. My parents made sure that was the first and last time I would ever lose without grace. If children can do that, what's stopping adults? Another lesson is that Florida sports are an example that past history does not guarantee future success. Look at Florida State University. It was once an all-women's school that revived its football program to help boost male enrollment in the 1940s. For decades, no one cared about the Seminoles. That changed in the 1980s once the Seminoles had the right coach and the right system. Florida State has since won 3 national championships and was cheated out of an opportunity to play for a 4th last fall. Politicians from both sides of the aisle publicly threatened legal recourse because a 13-0 season was not rewarded with a berth in the college football playoff. Surely there is a cautionary lesson about democracy there, right? If we are to keep our democracy, we must acknowledge history but not be beholden to it. Our history is littered with colorful characters who colored within the lines of democracy. They exerted their political power as politicos of all parties do. America leads through its democracy. We haven't always been perfect, as evidenced by the Nazis using our Jim Crow laws as the genesis of their anti-Semitism. And while information is more accessible than ever before, trusted information is more difficult to find than an orange grove in North Florida. My last point takes me back to my days as a community sports reporter. There were so many young athletes who were ecstatic anytime I would write a story, snap a photo, or fire off a tweet about their achievement. Some of these young athletes and emerging leaders became news consumers because they trusted that I would report credibly, accurately, fairly, and with context. Not everyone appreciated every story, but there was a genuine trust that my reporting, whether it was sports or social justice or otherwise, was authentic. More of us must ask, what is the motivation of the person and the organization that shares information with us? Is the public interest being served by our modern media conglomerates? The internet may have democratized information and access to it. There is nothing that indicates that whatever is disseminated on Al Gore's internet is truthful or accurate. The fact that some folks still believe the former vice president invented the internet is evidence of that. But I digress. If our democracy is to survive, people cannot be passive information consumers. That's the same as lying in bed with the lights off, watching a game. Eventually, the game will watch you once you're not paying attention and asleep. Democracy survives with people actively choosing information and applying it. This would be akin to leaving your house on a Friday night in the fall, going to a high school football game, and paying for a reserve ticket at midfield. You're still watching the game, but you made an active decision to see everything with your own eyes and your own perspective, instead of waiting nonchalantly for someone to contextualize your observations. You know, when Bill Clinton signed the Telecommunications Act of 1996, he noted our democracy depends on the diversity of voices. Democracy is more than a free election. It's more than one person, one vote. It's about the belief that when people use their voice at the ballot box, we can acknowledge the result was free and fair, and not coerced or swayed by threats of violence. This conversation, like every youth soccer, basketball, and football game, has a time limit. Unlike my athletic adventures of the 90s, there aren't orange slices or Slurpees awaiting you. What I will leave you with is a reminder that James Madison, the father of the United States Constitution, wrote in the Federalist Papers that government is the greatest of all reflections on human nature. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. Community sports are an opportunity to break from our political silos. They provide the necessary third spaces where we can find common ground with people with whom we disagree with on virtually everything else. They are laboratories for civic engagement and good citizenship. Those ideals are taught between the lines of ballparks, basketball courts, and on the dewy grass of a youth soccer field on a Saturday morning. The person who cuts the grass may be a Republican. The person at the concession stands may be a Democrat. The official may be a political agnostic. And the local reporter may know the political leanings of all three, but is more concerned with chronicling their community. In their own way, all four commit their time and talent to create a culture that is beyond their individual contribution. And while professional and high-level college sports are awash with money, media deals, and megalomaniacs who masquerade as coaches, there is still hope that the lessons so many of us learned as young athletes, to compete, acknowledge defeat, learn from your mistakes, and avoid complacency, are things that can be applied to our democracy before the clock on the American experiment hits zeros.